Welcome to CityWorks, a co-production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Each month, CityWorks explores the challenges and lived experiences of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities. On this edition of CityWorks, we are back at the International Labor Conference, Labor and the Crisis of Democracy, which took place this past spring at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies right here in New York City. The conference was a platform for organizers, union leaders, labor researchers, and historians to discuss and debate what organized labor needs to do to defend and challenge this White House's anti-union, anti-worker agenda. Last month on CityWorks, we heard from conference attendees, scholars and educators about today's key labor challenges in immigration, labor education, and public sector work. Today, we're going to hear from labor leaders and activists about the perilous state of our democracy and hear their urgent call to organize resistance. We begin with Bhairavi Desai. She is executive director of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. Under Desai's leadership, the union won back nearly $500 million in stolen wages for yellow cab and app drivers, and it established the first in the nation Taxi Workers Health and Disability Fund.
I tell you, I'm 52. I started organizing drivers when I was 23. And when I think about the poverty across this country, we don't talk enough about the poverty in America. It's like globalization, neoliberalism, austerity. We think these are all things that happened somewhere else. And we don't talk about how much of it is part of like the American fabric, I mean, you look around and you see how much people struggle. I look at my members who I love so much, like more than life itself. And there are days where I just can't believe how hard they have to work. Like it makes me sick, honest to God. That they have to work 60 to 70 hours just to put food on the table, and how many of them during COVID and since and even before will talk about, the sacrifices in terms of like the amount of groceries they have to cut back on because we had a massive inflation, historic inflation in 2022, 2 years after a pandemic. And they're literally having to choose between gasoline and groceries. And you hear about people that say, well, don't talk about inflation because there's going to be an election and that can make the Democrats look bad because they're the ones in power right now. And all I could think to myself is, like, I don't give a because people are struggling and they're suffering and they deserve a better life. Life is beautiful. It's such a gift. Like we're so fortunate to be alive, And people deserve to like not feel hunger and not have to tell their children that they can't afford something. Not have to tell their children, I have to work. I can't spend that extra time with you. Or to say to themselves, I can't make that doctor's appointment today because if I don't go to work, I could get fired. My brother's a retail worker, and we're always comparing stories. The number of stories of, like, people on dialysis, chemotherapy, people who are caretakers. We don't value our caretakers enough. People who take care of family members or friends who need them because we have a rotten system, healthcare system, that under capitalism doesn't value you when you're no longer considered productive, right? And so people are just kind of cast out and they're displaced. And how many workers, live in that constant fear? Workers, people who build the wealth in this society. Workers, the people without whom this society cannot function. Workers, the people whose labor, whose blood and sweat is the only reason that we have the highest number of billionaires in the history of the world. That we live in a society with paved streets and with some level of functional systems. You know, people deserve better. And we as unionists, we must do better. We as unionists must recognize that we are the people that hold the power to truly win something better. There really is only one answer, and that answer is to organize. In numbers, there is power. We used to put this in our flyers when we first started organizing in the mid-90s, and Giuliani would constantly threaten to arrest people. We would say, okay, well, if you don't want to get arrested, then we need more people than police out there. That's the only answer. You know, if you don't want to get shut down, then you need to lock arms and make it physically impossible for them to remove you. You know, if they're going to make an example out of one of us, we need to band together so they know that the rest of us are going to demand an answer. And, you know, workers live this out every day, right? I have really seen this. You know, maybe drivers as immigrants may be reluctant to join certain neighborhood actions, but when their job is under attack, when they know that, you know, that their wages are being stolen or that they're being locked into poverty, people find the courage that they need to really fight back, because they understand there's no way out. You know, you go to work every day not to stay poor. You're trying to get the hell out of that poverty. And you also understand, I think, more than the necessity, you understand your power. You know that, yeah, you need that job, but guess what? That job needs you. And you understand that. And so workers, you know, have a consciousness about their power that really gets developed through the course of your labor. You know, you hold it in your very hands through the work that you are doing. The job of a labor movement, the job of a workers' rights movement, and the job of a progressive movement and a left and social movements that love workers, that love working people, that believe in justice, that despise war and genocide and inequality and racism and patriarchy. Our job is to stand in solidarity of workers who have that courage and have the vision to be willing to fight that system. Because, you know, at the end of the day, there truly is no more of a powerful force in our society than organized working people. You know, when I think about the current moment that we are in, the thought that keeps coming back to me over and over and over again is, I think that we as unionists, the task that we have is to find a way to get all of organized labor to call for a mass action. And I know people talk about general strikes. Yes, I know people talk about general strikes, and, you know, strikes are a process. You know, it takes real organizing work to get to a strike. They are the best thing in the world, but they take a lot of damn work. You know, I always say to all our organizers, you might forget your kids' names one day, but you'll never forget the date of the strike. And this is true. But, you know, but as part of that, but if we're ever really are going to get to a general strike, you got to have a roadmap. You need an escalation plan, right? We're not just going to go from here to there. There's got to be a roadmap. And I think, you know, why doesn't the labor movement have more, you know, mass actions, like masses, like millions of people marching in DC. Bring down the buses from everywhere, and really show this is not, civil society America, which they fear less because they think people don't vote and because we have a two-party system that Wall Street finances, right? But these are workers. It doesn't matter if we vote or not. We can bend your society. And so why, we as a labor movement, we need to show that we need to flex our muscle. We need to show that we have that capacity to organize. And through our organizing, we can truly, inspire and organize the rest of the society along with us.
That was Bhairavi Desai, Executive Director of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, speaking at a labor conference called Labor and the Crisis of Democracy, which was held recently at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. You're watching CityWorks. While we're at the conference, we also had a chance to speak backstage with Tarso Ramos and Alex Hahn. Ramos, for nearly 2 decades, was Executive Director of Political Research Associates, a research group studying the right-wing populist movement in the United States. His work's been featured in many outlets, including The Guardian and The New York Times. Hahn is one of the most respected labor and political organizers in the nation, who, in addition to serving as Midwest Political Director for Bernie 2020, has worked to amplify the power of community and labor organizations at bargaining for the common good. And in 2023, Hahn was appointed Executive Director of In These Times magazine. I began our conversation by asking Tarso Ramos to describe where he thinks we are at. What's the situation in which we find ourselves right now?
If we think of 3 stages of authoritarian acceleration, authoritarian attempt, breakthrough, and consolidation, we've experienced multiple attempts in the United States, most famously or notoriously January 6th. We are past attempt, we're in breakthrough. And my assessment is we probably have between 12 and 18 months at the most to try to stop, to forestall authoritarian consolidation, the conditions under which any honest person would say that we are functioning under an autocracy, under an authoritarian regime. So I think we are experiencing, we're in the midst of a coup. Actually, we're in the midst of 2 coups. The coup that many of us prepared for, right? The authoritarian bloc represented by MAGA with Christian nationalists and libertarians and sectors of the business community, and the Christian right being its largest player, who galvanized around the project of Project 2025 and a few other pieces, set of policy prescriptions, and a strategy to concentrate power in the executive branch and to negate the power of checks and balances from the legislative and the judicial. I think the coup that we did not prepare for was the force accelerator that most people experience as Doge. It's the Musk and Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen set of actors who are not only lending their support to that, but who have a different endgame. They're not so much interested in a strong state through which to advance authoritarian and pro-business or policies, or merely to enrich themselves, although they are enriching themselves. They are not interested in the nation state system. They are interested in wringing the profits out of the public sector, and they're interested in accelerating the demise of civilian governance altogether. They're not interested in a state that mediates between corporate titans like themselves, oligarchs like themselves, and everyday people and workers. They want to cut out the middleman. They're interested in forms of direct corporate domination and rule. And so both of those coups are unfolding in real time, and they're both in cooperation and in competition and tension with each other. The elitists of these tech oligarchs, represented by neo-reaction, which we could talk about, and then the more populist, far-right populist wing, represented by Bannon and Stephen Miller and all of that.
I'm seeing a lot of people in the streets, and a lot of people wondering what their marching orders are.
A lot of that is pointed toward what are the actual practical applications of protests, not just to say, let's get the biggest number of people out. At the moment that that makes the most sense to do that. It's about how do we tie these things together to real, practical applications. In the context of May Day, we saw in Philadelphia civil disobedience action as a part of it in support of hotel workers in Unite Here. So you saw a little bit of a synthesis, I think, in Philadelphia, where you had, Bernie Sanders been barnstorming the country, speaking to tens of thousands of people. He spoke at the May Day rally. At the same time, the president of the Philadelphia Central Labor Council took a rest with hotel workers during that action to protest. So we start to see a bit of how we can bring into alignment big numbers of people with, I think, real immediate and tangible goals, which is not the whole of what we need, but which is a really good start to kind of feeding, I think, a much more tactically dynamic set of actions going forward.
I think there's fairly sophisticated local organizing going on. Where I think there is a vacuum of leadership that meets this moment is nationally. We don't have a national resistance party who's telling us what time it is and is actually moving into action. And the reflexes of many national networks and organizations were built for a different moment, a different period of contestation with the right and with the state than we're in now. And so much of that infrastructure has been built to rally folks around a particular set of policy solutions to grievances. Well, the courts are not going to save us. Congress is not going to save us, is not going to be able to advance a robust policy initiative. So what's required in this period of contestation are a different set of fights with power that most of our movements and organizations weren't built for. And so we're in this in-between moment where there's enormous energy, there's enormous engagement in the streets, and there's a failure of imagination and of containers of leadership to direct that in ways that can be effective in building power. And so we have to recognize that we're in a different conjuncture. There's a level of consolidation of authoritarian power, which is very strong and moving very quickly. By some measures, the rate of democratic backsliding in the United States right now has no contemporary parallel. If we look at other cases of the rise of authoritarian parties, it's happening very fast in the United States. And there's still a lot of denialism in the United States about what's here. There's still a lot of, I think, false hope that a reversal could be achieved in the midterms, for instance. I think contestation in the midterms will be very important. It's not going to reverse this. We're entering a phase where of contest in the United States where the analogs we should be looking for and at for lessons are much closer to the mass rallies in Belarus or in Poland, or the construction of the United Democratic Front in South Africa to defeat the apartheid regime. And those aren't policy coalitions. Those are coalitions that align cross-class and cross-ideology from many different sectors of society to withdraw support for the regime. So mass non-cooperation, both in some ways that we would recognize, labor withdrawals and slowdowns, but other forms of mass non-cooperation. And so we have to turn our attention away from what are the ways that we fought for policy gains over the last several decades and learn from our own history, abolition movement, civil rights movement, early rainbow period, and many examples abroad for what does it take? What are the conditions that produce successful reversals or U-turns, right, from authoritarian consolidation into a possibility of democratic renewal.
Well, is that why you're here at a labor conference, looking for that kind of thinking and organizing?
I'll tell you one of the reasons I'm at a labor conference is when we look at the history of U-turns from democratic backsliding to democratic revival, the success rate is about 50%. Now, that's not terrible. That means there's hope. But that's a coin toss. That's a coin toss. Where there's active, vibrant union participation, the odds go up to about the low 80s%. And so it's not the only thing we need to figure out. And many of these examples are drawn from periods where there was higher labor density than there is in the United States right now. So it's no magic bullet. And without active, central participation by working people in the organizations that represent them. Unfortunately, we don't have parties, mass parties in this country that represent working people. We don't win, or it's a coin toss whether we do. And so I'm interested in winning. And I'm interested in how we build the coalitions that have the highest chance of success. And that includes a fundamental strategy of involving unions and other worker organizations.
My eye is also on where are the unions that occupy critical places where change is really possible internally. Some of that is going to come from bottom up grassroots movements. Some of it is going to come from legacy old time leaders who actually listen to their members about what needs to happen and what they need.
I think in this country, not to sugarcoat, and I don't think we've been, the conditions, which are truly dire, I do believe that there is a anti-authoritarian and pro-democracy majority, and so that's an incredible opportunity to build the containers that allow it to behave as a majority and to win on the basis of that. I think back to other really challenging phases in American history. I think about the abolitionist movement, right? And I liken our challenge in this period to that. We not only need to defeat, as they did, slavery, we need to build the power to do that, and on the momentum of that gain, to usher in a new progressive period of possibility, right? Out of the defeat of slavery, we get the first experiments in multiracial democracy in the history of the United States with Reconstruction. Same with the long civil rights movement. It not only eviscerates legal white supremacy and the white monopoly on political power, it ushers in a fundamentally new period that redefines the meaning of citizenship. Who gets to be a citizen? To whom is government responsible? Indeed, who has the right to govern in this country? Completely changed by that. Here we are in another very difficult cycle where our job is not only, not a small task, to defeat authoritarianism and fascism in the US and its tentacles around the globe, but to do it in a way that builds momentum to usher in a new cycle of progressive politics in society that wins a multiracial, feminist, and worker-centered democracy that we would want to live in and we would want our descendants to live in. And that's a big job. It happens that it's come up on our watch, and so we have to just get to it in any way we can.
I think I heard marching orders. Tarso, Ramos, and Alex Hahn were speaking with me backstage at the Labor and the Crisis of Democracy conference, which was held this past spring in New York City. A number of well-known labor leaders attended that conference. One lesser-known leader, Reverend Ryan Brown, flew up from North Carolina to be part of it. Reverend Brown is a pastor and co-founder and current president of Carolina Amazonians United for Solidarity and Empowerment, or CAUSE, which is organizing workers at an Amazon warehouse in Garner, North Carolina.
I come to understand my world through two disciplines, like all human beings. There's something about how you move, how you operate, and how you comprehend this world. I understand my world through theology, and I understand my world through history. And when I put history and I put theology together, I see liberation theology. This is nothing new. Solomon said that there is nothing new under the sun. This is nothing new. We are living in some perilous times. Make no mistake about it. But it's not the first time that our species have lived in perilous times with pharaohs who are giving people work without any brick, without any straw. This is nothing new. What is the best of our tradition? What have they always done? They have always figured out a way to organize, to mobilize, and to agitate. And those very people that we look up to in history, regardless of who that individual may be, for me personally, that's folks like Harriet Tubman, that's folks like Fannie Lou Hamer. If you just take those two, and I can stop right there, they were just regular, everyday human beings. No education, but they knew that fundamentally something was wrong about the world or the context that they were living in. And Emerson says, to be great is to be misunderstood. That's why we still talk about them today. They were just regular people. And it may seem like a very big world, but what separated them? It was the resilience and it was the faith. And that's how CAUSE operates. That's how we move. And that's what I would suggest to you.
Resilience, faith, and organize.
Yes.
What's your next project?
Since this little country boy from Waco, North Carolina has been organizing, and coming to conferences like this and networking with other Amazon workers, regardless if that Amazon worker is in Germany, Japan, and Alabama, or New York City, when you have these conversations, you realize real quick that Amazon uses the exact same playbook. It doesn't change, no matter the time zone, no matter the state, or no matter the continent. It's the same playbook. And so our project is to build regional solidarity, to build national solidarity, and global solidarity, because that's what it's going to take to beat this corporation that is changing a lot of folks' lives.
That was Reverend Ryan Brown, co-founder and current president of Carolina Amazonians United for Solidarity and Empowerment, which is organizing workers at an Amazon warehouse in Garner, North Carolina. And that's it for our two-part special edition of CityWorks. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. And be sure to download the CUNY TV app, where you can watch part 1 of this special series and all of CUNY TV's programming online. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.